This story was about a boy named Changmin. The events began in Seoul, an ordinary boy who was taking a bus to Donghae. But what was unusual about this story was the moon. It always lured in different people in the darkness, like a nightlight for the earth. But it particularly attracted Changmin. Suddenly, a message arrived on his phone, but he found it uninteresting, for he was drawn to only one thing: the moonlight. The message on his phone said that the moon was very beautiful today. Suddenly, Changmin sharply opened the curtain and let the moonlight flood the room, guided by some incomprehensible force. Meanwhile, he had already boarded the bus and called his friends. They were already relaxing at the beach, having so much fun that they couldn't even wait for their friend. The others called out to the boy who was on the phone, so he hung up and said they would sort everything out when he arrived. It annoyed him that there was a sea in Seoul. Why travel so far? The bus had already departed, when suddenly it came to a screeching halt, and even the passengers couldn't hold on. A man in a mask entered, apologizing for being late. Upon entering, he immediately began to cough violently. He also had an unpleasant smell because he was sweating profusely. But what stood out the most was that this guy was swaying from side to side. He paid no attention to it. He was only annoyed that the trip had started so loudly. But that didn't stop him from falling asleep. The happiness didn't last long, for he woke up to music. And then there was that smell. Changmin fully awoke and realized that the music was playing nearby. His neighbor was listening to music so loudly that it could be heard even through the headphones. He decided to tell her about it, but received only silence in response. Changmin took a loud breath as his nerves were starting to fray, after which he shouted directly in her ear, causing her to jump. Then he calmed down again and calmly said that if she could hear him now, could she please turn the volume down a bit, as she wasn't at home. Suddenly, the neighbor just screamed. Changmin asked why she was so scared, but stopped mid-sentence. For right beneath them was a pool of blood. He immediately turned back to understand what was going on, and saw a man covered in blood, with it streaming directly from his nose. Of course, the bus stopped, and an ambulance arrived. Everyone stepped outside but couldn't tear their eyes away. The man was covered and carried away by the workers, as he showed no signs of life. Everyone whispered among themselves, trying to understand what had happened. Meanwhile, Changmin was vomiting nearby, while the bus driver ordered everyone to switch to another vehicle, as they were leaving soon. But that rotten smell wouldn't leave his nose. Changmin asked the driver to let him go to the bathroom, but the man asked him to wait, as they would arrive soon. However, he had a counter-argument in the form of gag reflexes, so the driver let him go. As he walked, he pulled out his phone to inform his friends that he was about to lose his mind. Changmin told his friends about the guy sitting behind him who had just died suddenly. He decided to wash his face a bit to freshen up. Then he took his phone, but it slipped from his hands immediately. His fingers weren't cooperating for some reason. His reaction was also slightly delayed. Suddenly, Changmin just fell and hit his head on the sink. Then he fell to the floor, losing consciousness. Although at first, he tried to get up, but nothing worked. Meanwhile, several hours passed and it grew dark. But Changmin was still lying on the floor. Suddenly, he woke up sharply. Changmin got up but couldn't understand what was happening and where he was. His head was pounding terribly. When he realized what had happened, he dashed out of the bathroom, hoping his bus would still be there. But of course, that didn't happen, as too much time had passed. However, there was something. Everything was oddly blue. Changmin decided to approach cautiously, when suddenly he stopped because he heard someone scream. A man ran out from behind. He wanted to talk to him, but the man paid no attention and kept running. Suddenly, he froze. Then he raised his gaze. His eyes were strangely vacant, as if he were hypnotized. The man was staring at the moon. Then his skin suddenly began to burn and cover with wounds as if he had sunburn. Suddenly, his bones began to crack. First in his arm, and then his whole body cracked, bones bending in the opposite direction. Changmin stood in shock, not understanding anything. Suddenly, the man sharply turned to the side, but he quickly hid behind a trash can, sensing danger. Changmin crouched down and listened to the sounds. He thought maybe these were hallucinations and that he was just imagining things. Suddenly, right in front of him appeared that deranged man who now looked more like a monster. Suddenly, Changmin woke up at that moment, screaming. Gradually, he realized that it was just a dream. Suddenly, a notification arrived on his phone, vibrating intensely. But who writes at 3 a.m.? It turned out to be an emergency alert, asking not to go out into the moonlight. At first, this seemed very strange to him. He looked around his room. It was as blue as in his dream. Suddenly, Changmin noticed 21 unread messages. They were asking if Kunmin had seen the moon and urging him to go out and look at it. This angered him, as who would joke like that at night? However, when he put his phone down, another message arrived. It was almost the same thing. Suddenly, the boy's phone began to receive a flood of notifications, one after another, all with the same text. Kenman didn't understand what was happening, as if everyone had gone mad at once. But he understood one thing for sure. They were trying to trick him into looking at the moon. This only amused him, how everyone suddenly wanted to play a prank on him. But then Kanmin noticed something strange. The messages had been sent 2 weeks ago. He couldn't believe it. He scrolled down, and all the messages were sent 2 weeks ago. Then Kanmin looked at the date. It was August 15th. But when he had taken the bus to his friends, it was August 1st. Exactly 2 weeks had passed since that strange death of the man on the bus. Suddenly, the curtains began to move as if a wind had blown. Kanmin approached the calendar and saw that he had turned the page, as he was definitely conscious. At that moment, another notification about the moon arrived. This was starting to irritate him. Why was everyone suddenly talking about the moon and messaging him? He approached the window. He even wanted to touch it, but suddenly froze. Kanmin remembered the expression on that man's face, and what had happened to him. Even if it was a dream, it was still eerie. No, Kanmin couldn't believe it was a dream. It wasn't him. But if it wasn't a dream, then what? Suddenly, that man from the parking lot lunged at him again. Kanmin was so scared that he fell to the ground screaming. But when he came to his senses, he realized there was no man, just a window and that blue light. Surely he had indeed been hallucinating. Suddenly, another message arrived. But this time, someone was knocking at the door. Kanmin stood in shock and didn't rush to approach. Then he heard a voice asking for help. Kanmin got up and began shouting that it was too late and that the stranger needed to leave. From behind the door, they asked if the boy had received any strange messages. This seemed odd to him, but he said it was possible. It turned out Kanmin wasn't the only one receiving them. The neighbor found this strange, so he went out to look, and the moonlight was indeed beautiful. He had never seen such beauty before. He was asked to step outside for just a moment and take a look at the moon. Kanmin began to step back slowly, but the knocking at the door grew only louder. It seemed that now some huge monster was knocking. No human could have such strength. Suddenly, someone screamed in an inhuman voice, urging him to just step outside and take a look. These screams and knocks didn't stop for a second. Suddenly, it began to dawn. And then it became so quiet abruptly, even unusually so. Kanmin approached the door to check the peephole. But there was no one outside. The blue light had also faded as the moon began to hide. Kanmin dared to open the door and see what was happening outside. He cautiously peeked out but saw nothing unusual. Everything was clear, just as always. Suddenly, someone began calling him sharply on the phone. It was from work. Changmin decided to answer the call after all, and he was immediately yelled at about the trouble this scoundrel had caused. He asked what the guy meant, but the boss yelled at him that Changmin was still asleep, even though he should have been at work long ago. Changmin rushed to the store, fully dressed in a suit that covered his body. But that guy seemed not to recognize him and first asked what he would like to buy. Then he began to scream, as Changmin had terrified him with his appearance of a robber. Changmin was sweating profusely, as the heat outside was unbearable, and he explained that they needed to hide from the moonlight. But his partner asked what he was talking about. Changmin said that the change in light was a bit frightening, but nothing would happen if it touched him. Then he showed him a message on his phone, to which his partner replied that some people had lost their minds when the moon turned blue, but most would not pay any attention to that warning. However, Changmin could not believe this, as he had seen it with his own eyes. Or was it a dream? In any case, something very strange was happening. His partner told him that he had never acted like this before, but in reality, Changmin didn't even remember being there. Then Changmin told Hyun that he had sent him a text 2 weeks ago. His partner pretended not to remember it, but he showed him a suggestion to play soccer at night, to which Hyun simply said he was tired and ordered him to change, thus ending the topic. But Changmin did not want to end it, and his partner interrupted him, saying he hadn't written anything and went to the bathroom. He hadn't sent him any message, and it didn't seem like he was lying. Then Changmin scrolled through all the messages and decided to call his friend Min, as he should remember. After a long ring, someone on the other end shouted that Changmin had completely lost his mind, calling in the middle of the night. Changmin apologized, saying he would go crazy if he didn't ask about it. He asked if Min had texted him 2 weeks ago. The friend asked if that was when the guy died on the bus, so it wasn't a dream. Suddenly, Kanmin's eyes widened in realization of what he remembered had happened. Min didn't understand why his friend was asking if he remembered that incident. Min couldn't calm down and asked about the moon and whether anyone had texted him. But Min denied everything, after which Min realized there was nothing to search for here and simply hung up. He couldn't believe it. Could it be that no one had really written anything to him? But then, what about the messages he was still receiving? Messages from 2 weeks ago were only coming now. It was strange. Suddenly, Min noticed something. Hyun was standing by the window just silently and motionlessly. Suddenly, a clicking sound was heard. Min's expression changed abruptly. He was scared. After all, Hyun wasn't just staring for no reason. The clicking didn't stop. It was coming from the monster. He was the one making it. Min decided it was Hyun, so he called his partner. He turned sharply, which startled Min greatly. Then he asked if it was really that creepy, and pointed at the guy behind him, saying it was him making those sounds, not him. There was indeed some strange and creepy guy at the window, just scratching the store's glass. Hyun called the police, saying there was a person with lunar delusions near their store, after which he told Min that the police would arrive soon and take care of it while he was leaving until morning. Min began to worry and panic about that lunatic, to which Hyun said not to worry, as he didn't think it was a real threat. But he didn't believe that. Min was expecting something truly dangerous now. But Hyun calmly opened the door, and just as calmly walked past the lunatic with lunar delusions. He quickly shifted his attention back to Min, and continued scratching the glass. Min felt like he had fallen into some strange dream from which he couldn't wake up. Meanwhile, events shifted to the hospital where Min was undergoing an MRI. It was an MRI of the brain. The doctor told him everything was clear and no abnormalities were detected. But as a fact, the likelihood of amnesia due to physical shock was practically zero. Usually it was all psychological. He suggested that this was the problem with Min. He left the office with even more questions and thought about the doctor's diagnosis. Did the doctor mention this psychological shock to him? That guy was banging on the glass. He continued banging, even when his fingers wore down to the bone. As Hyun had promised, that lunatic did nothing. But Min still couldn't forget his gaze. Due to his partner's indifference, Min constantly had a question. Was he the strange one, or had the whole world lost its mind? It didn't matter whether the moon's influence had turned them into this. Min speculated that over the last 2 weeks, people had simply gotten used to such things. But the problem was that he remembered absolutely nothing. But he had to remember. So Min began calling everyone he knew. Meanwhile, he crossed off the last number. But they all told him the same thing. Everyone knew about the events, but no one knew about the messages. Min concluded that he had fallen off the radar for 2 weeks because he had been busy at work. Suddenly, he wondered if he had only received those messages when there was no moon. At that moment, his thoughts were interrupted by a customer in a black biker suit who walked in. But his greeting was ignored. Min looked outside. The moon didn't look blue. Suddenly, a shadow loomed over him. The customer silently held the items. Min said he would ring everything up now. Suddenly, a female voice spoke, asking for a bag. But what scared him was that she still hadn't taken off her helmet. Min did everything and named the total. She placed her phone on the counter to pay, when suddenly it vibrated from a flood of messages. Min already had a trigger for this. He immediately paid attention. What he saw left him in shock, as there were the same messages that had been sent to him. Min couldn't believe his eyes. Could it be that he really wasn't the only one receiving such things? It seemed that his shocked gaze was noticed by her as well. So she quickly placed a bill down and fled very quickly. It was clear she was anxious. Min realized that this person was in the same situation as him, as these messages and her whole body were covered. Without thinking long, he grabbed his jacket and ran after her. He stepped outside and looked around, when suddenly someone grabbed Min by the arm, and it was that strange guy with lunar delusions. He had a very horrifying and frightening expression. And his hand, was it contagious? The lunatic reached it towards Min's face, so he simply fell to the ground. It seemed that this monster was not as innocent as last time. So Min quickly got up and began to run, although the monster was chasing him. He recalled Hyun's words, who swore that this guy posed no threat. It seemed that Min had fallen behind when suddenly he tripped over a pebble and just fell right in front of the lunatic who definitely didn't want to befriend him. Min was already thinking of saying goodbye to his life, as he didn't know what to expect. When suddenly, the biker girl lunged at the monster. She inflicted a wound on his head, but she was ready to do it again. All ready for Changmin. The boy's heart raced rapidly, but she lowered her weapon, after which she dropped the stick. Then she suddenly turned to the side as if she noticed something. She looked up at the sky, the moon had hidden, so she took off her helmet. It turned out to be the same girl Changmin had sat with on the bus. Jimin recognized him too. She said she remembered that he had lost consciousness back then at the stop. Changmin's mind was filled with questions. How had this girl appeared so suddenly, and why was she so straightforward? Jimin said that he probably wouldn't believe her, but it was time to share the information. Changmin stood up silently, after which he began to recount that he had gone to the restroom and the subsequent encounter with the monster. And it seemed that Jimin knew what had happened next that day. Events shifted back to the past on August 1st. After a long break, there were too many people, so there wasn't enough room for everyone on the next bus. Therefore, those who couldn't fit were told to wait for the next transport. Jimin wondered if she should also stand in line, but then she saw Changmin, who was just heading to the restroom. She noticed that the boy looked very unwell, when suddenly someone leaned on her shoulder. Jimin initially didn't understand what was happening. She was lost in her thoughts. But then she saw a man with blood running from his nose. He looked just as terrible as the corpse from the bus. She immediately got up from her seat and screamed. She began calling for help, but then she abruptly fell silent, as she saw that suddenly everyone was feeling unwell at the stop. They were losing consciousness rapidly, and blood was flowing from their noses. Then Jimin realized that something very strange and dangerous was happening, when suddenly the man who had fallen grabbed her hand. He was pleading for help while covered in blood. Then Jimin decided to call an ambulance and tried to reassure the man that everything would be all right. But suddenly, drops of blood began to drip onto her phone. Jimin instinctively reached for her nose and saw blood on her hands. Jimin was very scared. Her heart began to race, and there was a ringing in her ears, when suddenly everything swam before her eyes. And Jimin also fell unconscious, after which she came to her senses, when she was behind the wheel of her motorcycle, and Jimin was speeding down the road. When the realization hit her, Jimin immediately lost control of the bike. At first, she nearly crashed into the roadside. Then she veered into oncoming traffic, causing the truck driver major problems. He barely missed her. She could have died right there. Jimin stopped and gasped loudly, realizing what had happened. The truck driver got out and began yelling at her that Jimin had completely lost her mind if she was trying to end her life like that. But Jimin didn't even hear him. The girl was trying to understand what had happened and why she was on the road. The driver continued to shout, promising to send her behind bars if she wasn't sober. Suddenly, his skin began to smoke as if it were on fire. The driver started cursing loudly, expressing his outrage. Therefore, Jimin stepped closer to him to help. The man lowered his head, standing still and silent. Then, without warning, he swung at her very sharply and unexpectedly. The girl managed to dodge, but it wasn't easy on a motorcycle. When Jimin could see the man's face, she realized something very strange and terrible was happening. Because Jimin was distracted, the man managed to hit her on the helmet. After that, he grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her toward him. Then he even began to choke her, doing so with a strength that seemed inhuman. Fortunately, Jimin found the strength within herself and struck him on the head with her helmet. She was not one to be easily frightened, but the man retaliated with a blow to her ribs. Jimin screamed, realizing that a fistfight was beginning, in which the lunatic clearly had the advantage. So without thinking long, she decided to make a quick escape. The thought that Jimin would die if this lunatic caught her motivated the girl. Therefore, she quickly jumped on her motorcycle and hit the gas. Although the man managed to grab hold of her, Jimin kicked him in the face with all her strength. And then he finally let go. Now Jimin was safe. While riding, Jimin took out her phone and saw the date, August 15th. The girl recounted that after that incident, Jimin encountered 2 more such monsters. They had completely lost their minds and wanted to kill her. Changmin wondered if those were not precautionary measures. He was afraid his family would report to the police. Jimin asked if he really didn't understand what was happening, and he said it was no longer a human. Suddenly, they all saw that the monster had disappeared, leaving only a pool of blood behind. Changmin suggested calling the police first to find the missing person, but Jimin forbade him from doing so. Changmin stood his ground, saying that if they didn't act now, the cops wouldn't find the monster later. This angered her, and Jimin simply took his phone away. Her expression became more serious, and her voice dropped a tone as Jimin said it was not a request. Changmin said they had to catch the monster quickly, to which she asked what he was going to tell the cops, that a girl had beaten a monster? Jimin looked him in the eyes and said she wasn't going to go to jail just for saving someone. Changmin asked what they should do then. Jimin suggested following him, as the monster couldn't have gone far. After all, if they brought it to the police station, the cops would believe them. Finding the monster wasn't too hard, given the bloody trail. They cautiously approached from around the corner of the building. Then they suddenly lunged to catch the monster off guard. But it was empty. The blood trail had deceived them. Then Jimin took off her helmet, as there was no danger, and advised Changmin to take off his mask as well. He wanted to object. But Jimin explained that everything was supposed to be fine on nights when the moon wasn't so blue. She had forgotten to wear her helmet and learned this the hard way. For some reason, Changmin believed her and complied. Suddenly, they were shouted at to drop the weapon immediately. It turned out to be the police, and they were about to detain the two of them. Their expressions indicated that both of them felt their hearts drop to their feet. The cops wanted to know what the blood on the pavement was from. They exchanged glances. Meanwhile, they reached the store. Changmin showed on the surveillance cameras that the lunatic had attacked him. It was clear how the monster had struck him. Changmin tried to justify Jimin, saying it was self-defense and she had simply saved him. Otherwise, he would have died. It seemed the officer agreed, saying that Changmin was free to go. So he began to put away his things before the next shift started. The officer sat somewhat slumped, staring at the camera. Then Jimin came out, asking how everything went. Changmin said it was all supposed to be fine since the cameras recorded the moment of the fight, showing that the monster had attacked first. Jimin asked if the police didn't think they had killed him and hidden the body when they saw the blood. Changmin said the police also found the monster strange, so that definitely wouldn't happen. Therefore, he thanked her for saving him, but didn't even turn to say it to her face. She asked what such gratitude was for. Changmin explained that he had been suspicious of her the whole time, even though she had saved him. It was all because he was completely confused and couldn't trust anyone. Jimin said she felt the same way, as her whole family swore they hadn't contacted her. She didn't know whom to believe. Then Changmin suggested they work together, as they might encounter more dangerous things. Jimin froze for a moment and just stared at him. But their conversation was interrupted by the officer, saying that they had reviewed all the footage, so they were heading to the station to file a report. Changmin asked if they had seen the clothes that person was wearing. The officer requested that it was a monster dressed in dark, thick clothing. Another officer laughed at this. Suddenly, Jimin interjected, saying that everything Changmin said was true. As if that monster had been an ordinary person, he wouldn't have been able to beat him like that. The officer said it was hard to be sure as the recording wasn't very clear, and even if the monster had attacked first, Jimin's actions exceeded self-defense. Suddenly, the officer's radio vibrated. His partner said that a suspicious man was chasing citizens nearby and ordered him to intercept him immediately. Another officer asked them to leave their contact information as they had to head out on a mission. Suddenly, the partner ran off, telling them to hurry, and a concerned Changmin asked what they should do. The officer said they would contact them soon and ordered them not to leave the city. Changmin agreed. Suddenly, Hyun walked in and asked what was happening. Changmin emotionally recounted that the guy who had been scratching at their glass suddenly started throwing himself at them. Hyun said that guy had never bothered him, so maybe they had provoked him themselves. Jimin couldn't take her eyes off the police, fearing she would be held accountable. Suddenly, the officer looked at her, his eyes turning a very deep blue. Changmin told her not to worry, as the police would see everything and would be on their side. So they left the store saying goodbye to Hyun. The partner sarcastically thanked them for their hard work. He watched the two of them leave, and his eyes suddenly turned a very deep blue as well. Meanwhile, Changmin walked ahead, with Jimin following him, and he didn't understand why she kept walking in his direction. So he said he was going that way and added that they would meet again tomorrow, after which he immediately took out his phone to check the news from the police. But then he noticed that Jimin was still following him. He decided she might live around there, but that wasn't the case. So he asked why Jimin was following him. She replied that Changmin himself had said they should be partners. After which, Jimin turned around and left, saying she didn't have a family. They went upstairs and she explained that she had come for a vacation, but her return ticket had expired. So she was stuck there and didn't know where to go, with no way to return home. Jimin apologized, saying she had no choice and had to stay under Changmin's care for a few days. He said he first needed to clean up his apartment, so he asked her to wait a bit in the hallway. While Min was making the bed, Jimin was washing her face in the bathroom. She froze in front of the mirror, after which, with a sad expression, she grabbed her cheek. Meanwhile, Min also took a shower, after which he went to bed, asking Marina if she was sure she didn't want to switch beds. But she was fine with it, although Min still had some questions. He asked how all of this had happened. It was a rhetorical question, after which Min wished her sweet dreams. But Jimin didn't want to sleep. She asked to reread his message about the moon, after a silent pause. Then he handed her his phone. Jimin was surprised at how many messages he had received, as she had only a few. Min said he also wanted to see her messages then, and Jimin, without a hint of doubt, handed over the phone. He asked what she thought about the people who denied sending those messages. She thought they had all been hacked. Min noticed that Jimin had also written 2 weeks ago. He said they had woken up on August 15th, so the messages should have been sent on the 1st. But today was August 17th, and the messages arrived today. So logically, they should have been sent on August 3rd. Jimin said they should find out what the phone defined as 2 weeks to figure it out. Suddenly, Min stood up, saying he had a theory if the messages had indeed been sent on the 3rd. But in the end, the day the messages arrived was August 15th when they woke up. Min wanted to say something else, to what conclusion he had come. But Jimin interrupted him, asking what would happen then. Meanwhile, night fell. Min was sleeping when suddenly someone called him. Groggy, he tried to find his mobile. With a weak voice, he greeted the caller. It turned out to be the police. When Min heard this, he immediately woke up. The officer said he wanted to come to his home and conduct an investigation. Min said they could come at any time. The officer also asked if that girl was with him. He wanted to inquire how the investigation was going, but the call abruptly ended. Then Min found all of this strange. Did the police really need to come for an investigation? At that moment, Jimin woke up. Min asked if it was strange that the police wanted to come, especially at night. Jimin grimaced, as she was still a bit anxious. But they had to wake up and prepare for the arrival. The rice was finished, so Min suggested ramen. Jimin agreed to everything. Min decided to go buy some groceries himself. The moon was as blue as always. The store was closed, but there was a sign saying the cashier was in the restroom. Nearby stood a guy who was also completely covered in clothing. He said he had been waiting forever, but no one had come. But Min could have been the seller himself, so he did just that, ringing up the customer's items. When asked if he needed a receipt, the man rudely said they could throw it away, after which he quickly left. Min was curious about that man's clothing. He thought maybe he should ask about the messages. But then it seemed to him that he had seen that look somewhere before. Suddenly, it was as if a light bulb went off in his head. He understood everything. The puzzle came together. Min quickly ran to the exit and started shouting for the man to wait for him. But he stopped before the exit when he saw a monster attacking the customer. Min felt his heart drop to his feet. Adrenaline was surging, for he saw Hyun there, his partner. The boy had grown massive and looked like a true monster. Min decided that going outside was a good idea. Hyun was completely captivated by that cyclist. Min fell to the ground from fear and surprise. After all, he clearly recognized his partner Hyun by the vest. After which he cautiously crawled back into the store, thinking about where to hide. Meanwhile, Jimin decided to watch television. The news opened with reports of brutal murders. She immediately understood that it was all the work of monsters. But the news said it was most likely terrorist groups. Not a word about monsters. Why did no one know about them? Or was it perhaps deliberately kept quiet? Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. It had to be the police. Jimin immediately opened the door without even asking who was there. But she encountered someone entirely unexpected. The police officer with bright blue eyes suddenly turned into a monster and was covered in horrific blisters. Jimin tried to slam the door shut again, but the creature was far too strong. So she simply couldn't hold on and fell back from the force of the monster's blow. It approached her, and Jimin didn't even have time to get up. Her heart raced faster. She feared it was the end for her. But fear gave her the strength to flee. She opened the window. Blue light poured in from outside, and the monster reacted to it very brightly. It continued to move toward her as if under hypnosis. Jimin couldn't think of anything better than to command the monster to stop and not come closer. Of course, that didn't help, and she had to flee again at the last moment. However, this time it was unsuccessful, as the monster grabbed her by the hair. It was so strong that with just one sweep of its hand, it threw her right at its feet. Jimin hit her head so hard that she immediately lost consciousness, and blood flowed from her nose again. The monster grabbed her by the face. But then it froze. For some reason, its expression changed sharply to one of shock. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the store. Changmin dared to step outside. He couldn't believe his eyes. After all, this man, Changmin, recognized him for sure. When he removed his mask, Changmin saw the same man who had lost consciousness and died on the bus. Suddenly, the boy spotted the man's bicycle. More precisely, his phone, which was there. There was a message from Lee stating that he had made the right choice and should head to exit number 3. This was getting more interesting. Changmin wanted to figure out where this man was headed. But there was no time for that now. He took out his phone and decided to call the police officer. The phone rang in his pocket, just as he was approaching Jimin. At the sound, she woke up and saw a shocked monster in front of her. Jimin didn't know what to do, but she knew for sure that a plan was urgently needed. Changmin still couldn't get through to the police officer. He decided that the cops just hadn't arrived yet, when suddenly someone called him. Picking up the receiver, Changmin heard the voice of the police officer. The boy said he had been trying to call them and asked if they were already on the scene, but the cops didn't understand where they were supposed to be. Changmin explained that an officer had called him, but the person on the other end didn't believe it and said to come to the station in the morning. Suddenly, the boy realized everything. The puzzle in his head clicked into place. He quickly ran home to save Jimin and arrived just in time when the monster loomed over her. Changmin couldn't believe his eyes. It was a trap. So he quickly grabbed the fire extinguisher that stood by the entrance and struck the monster on the head with it. He did this several times to ensure it worked, but he didn't stop. And when the monster fell to the ground, it was as if Changmin was taking revenge for something. A lot of aggression had built up in him. Then Jimin intervened, asking him to stop. Changmin didn't even understand why she was acting that way, when suddenly he realized that the monster had long been dead. Changmin wanted to understand what had happened, when suddenly something very strange began to happen to the monster. The mutations on its body started to simply disappear. They both couldn't believe it. How could this even be possible? Meanwhile, someone was heading to Changmin's apartment. The door was kicked in, so he entered by himself. Changmin began to panic, fearing everyone would think they had killed an ordinary cop. Jimin also panicked. Changmin said everything he thought. He hoped the police knew about the monsters, but they acted as if they didn't. He suggested telling the cops again, as they would believe them, but then Jimin yelled that he was driving her crazy with this police talk. She shouted for Changmin to finally come to his senses, as the cops couldn't be trusted. After a pause, Changmin asked what they should do then. At that moment, a neighbor entered his apartment and asked what had happened, as his door had been kicked in. Both of them were very frightened. Things were getting worse every moment. Changmin nervously said that nothing had happened and suggested the neighbor meet him inside. But he stood his ground, saying there was a lot of noise and female screams. Changmin lied. Changmin lied, saying it was the television turned up to the max. The neighbor didn't seem convinced and said he thought the television sounded different, but in any case, the homeowner had allowed him to check on Changmin, after which he said he was coming into the apartment. But the neighbor barely took a step when Changmin appeared. The neighbor was so startled that he began to get angry, and Changmin smoothly changed the subject, asking if he had woken him up. The man stood his ground, trying to find out the truth about what had happened, while Changmin kept lying. Then the neighbor asked why he was sweating. Changmin was shocked by such persistence. So he remembered that the neighbor had said he was preparing for exams and apologized, as it must be hard to study with all the noise in the house. But the neighbor said he had already finished everything and then asked to hang out a bit with Changmin. The boy said he wanted to rest and tactfully suggested the neighbor go home. But he wouldn't give up and asked for some water, as he had run out. The neighbor said he was surprised that Changmin was friendlier this time than usual. Then he looked into the boy's eyes, after which he quickly stood up, saying he would quickly check his apartment. Changmin raised his voice and became aggressive, reminding him that he had forbidden him to do that. And at that moment, the neighbor saw Jimin sitting on the bed. He asked her if everything was okay, as he had heard screams, to which Jimin replied that they just couldn't hold back. The neighbor felt ashamed. He understood what was going on, so Changmin called him an ignorant jerk and ordered him to get the hell out. He bowed, apologized for disturbing them, and wished them a good night. Suddenly, he noticed something and asked in a trembling voice if there was something under that blanket. A dead silence fell. Changmin said he could explain everything. The boy began to tell about the monster they had killed, but now it had turned into a human, and it all sounded so crazy. The neighbor didn't believe a single word they said. He approached the body while Changmin tried to justify himself. When the neighbor saw the body, everything became clear to him. He immediately wanted to flee the apartment to avoid becoming an accomplice. But Kanmin wasn't about to let him go that easily. The neighbor punched him in the jaw to escape. Jimin stood by the door, telling the neighbor to listen to them and calm down. But he didn't want to listen to anyone. He ran out of the apartment and slammed the door, saying he would listen to them when he reported it to the authorities. He immediately called the police and reported everything. Jimin told Kanmin that they had to flee, as the cops would be here soon. They didn't know where to run, but it was better than staying in the apartment. Jimin was driving the motorcycle. Neither of them knew where to go, but the farther away the better. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Neither the police nor their families knew about the strange messages. No one could be trusted. The world had become too strange a place. Changmin was only sure that trust was deserved only by those who acknowledged the existence of these strange monsters. Were they really the only ones who knew about them? Meanwhile, an unusual message arrived on Kanmin's phone, one he had never received before. It was from the same Lee Jae, asking if the boy's name was Kanmin and if monsters had attacked him. Changmin remembered seeing such a message on the cyclist's phone. Immediately, the next message came, asking not to tell anyone about their correspondence. Then Jimin ordered him to hold on tighter, as there was a police officer lying ahead. But Kanmin didn't listen to her, so he began to fall headfirst. The road and the street were filled with many people and cars. No one was worried about the moonlight, because of how fast Jimin was driving. Changmin decided to press himself tighter to avoid falling again. Meanwhile, they arrived at a gas station. Changmin was going to go to the restroom, but instead, he got caught up in his phone again. Suddenly, someone called him. It was Ju Won-lee. He had also been on that bus to Donghae, sitting in the second seat. Changmin tried to remember who had been sitting there but couldn't. He asked Won-lee why he was calling him. Won-lee replied that he understood the conversation was a bit strange, but he said they were all in the same boat, as he had also found himself in a similar situation. He added that he completely understood why Kanmin didn't trust anyone. Won-lee said that on that fateful day, everyone on the bus had been marked. That phrase stuck in the boy's mind. Changmin asked if Won-lee meant that these creatures had been targeting the passengers of that flight, and he confirmed it. Won-lee added that the news was filled with random victims. But one of the deceased was his neighbor on the bus. He claimed that one of those monsters tore his neighbor apart right before his eyes. As a result of his investigation, he found that all the victims were passengers on that bus route. After that, Won-lee suggested they all meet and discuss in detail what had happened. At first, Changmin was shocked by such a proposal. He understood that it was risky, as he did not overlook the fact that it could simply be a trap and they would all die there. After all, the cyclist whom the monster killed also wanted to meet with this Lee. Therefore, Changmin weighed all the pros and cons, gathering his thoughts. He then asked how Won-lee knew his name and that he had definitely been on that bus, but was told they would explain everything in person for safety. Changmin asked why he should believe them, to which Won-lee replied that there were all the reasons to do so. After all, he was sure that Changmin had already received similar messages. At that moment, the boy's phone was buzzing with offers to go outside. Meanwhile, Jimin followed Changmin. She saw that he was talking on the phone, so she decided to eavesdrop a little. Won-lee said he had sent similar messages to the other passengers, except for 2 who had bought tickets with cash and were impossible to find. He also added that at the next meeting they would have a code word. Changmin was to respond Vincent van Gogh when he heard artist. At that moment, Jimin approached. She immediately expressed outrage that Changmin was supposed to go to the bathroom actually. He asked her to check if any messages had come in, but her phone was empty. Meanwhile, Won-lee hung up the call. Jimin said that Changmin was probably very popular, as she received even fewer messages than the day before. Then he asked her if she had paid cash for the route to Donghae. At first, it seemed strange to her to be interrogated like that, but she had paid by card. This surprised Changmin. Jimin asked who he was talking to. Won-lee said he had sent messages to everyone. But why then had Jimin received nothing? Changmin looked into her eyes to understand if he could trust her. How could he doubt her? She had saved his life. Still, Changmin decided to confess, saying that Won-lee had called him. At that moment, he received another message from Won-lee, stating that everyone was to keep this a secret and not to trust anyone who had not received a message or did not say the code word. At that moment, Changmin's heart began to race. He was shocked and scared. Jimin asked why he turned away from her phone. Changmin wanted to come up with some lie, but he pondered whether he could really trust her, as she quickly ingratiated herself with him. Suddenly, Jimin snatched the phone from his hands, saying she was tired of these secrets. Kangmin tried to protest, but inside he was even glad that Jimin made this choice for him. She scrolled through something for a long time. Kangmin asked why she hadn't received a message and suggested that Wanli had made a mistake and sent it to the wrong number. Jimin turned sharply and stared at him. Despair was evident in her eyes. She said that some old lady from another route had asked her to swap tickets, and Wanli had probably contacted her. Her voice became very sad. She said they had been through so much together. They even sat together on the bus. But even now, he did not trust her. Kangmin apologized, saying he did trust her. He just wanted to figure out what was happening. Jimin still held his phone. Wanli wrote again, asking what Kangmin had decided. He was very persistent and impatient. Jimin handed over the phone so he could respond. Kangmin said that people who received messages from Wanli were soon dying from lunar monsters. Jimin understood nothing. Kangmin recounted about the guy who died on the bus and how the monster killed him. Jimin knew understood even less how a dead person could die again. Kangmin repeated Wanli's words that the monsters deliberately hunted the bus passengers. He also spoke about the gathering, but said that everything seemed quite suspicious. Jimin said they should agree, as they had no other options. Then Kangmin began to write to Wanli. He told about Jimin. Wanli initially thought she must have been an old lady, so her story was true. They arranged to meet near the shopping center. Meanwhile, they arrived at the meeting place. There were many people, but still, it all seemed quite suspicious and resembled a trap. Kangmin said they wouldn't be able to escape from such a crowd of lunatics. Jimin asked what he suggested then, to which Kangmin joked that they both killed a monster. He told her that he was very scared then, but still saved Jimin, to which she reminded him how she saved his butt. They looked around at the people, so carefree, while the cops were on their tails since morning. Suddenly, Kangmin began to cough. Jimin noticed this and asked how he was feeling. Kangmin insisted that everything was fine. They didn't know yet, but in reality, they were in big trouble. After all, someone completely covered in clothing was photographing them from above. When they approached the shopping center, Wanli called. He said he was changing the location. The meeting would be by the store in 5 minutes. Kangmin got angry and outraged that the conditions were changing so irresponsibly, to which Wanli said it would be safer that way. He wanted to shout more, but Wanli simply hung up. Kangmin told everything and said to Jimin that he had a bad feeling and didn't want to meet anymore. But she insisted that since they had come, there was no turning back. Kangmin continued to be outraged and wanted to cancel everything, but for some reason Jimin really wanted to attend the meeting and convince Kangmin. But it affected him. He agreed to go, but Jimin followed him because she was not local. There were so many people that they had to push through the crowd. Suddenly, Kangmin noticed his partner Hyun. After that, he disappeared abruptly. Maybe he just imagined it, just like that time. Kangmin decided to ignore it. He walked so fast that he didn't even notice the passerby in front of him. They collided and Kangmin spilled someone's drink. The man immediately began to yell loudly and complain that Kangmin wasn't watching where he was going. But the boy was looking at the person behind, whose half of the face began to melt away, like ice cream in the heat. Kangmin's eyes widened sharply as he understood perfectly what that meant. So he immediately began to run, and Jimin ran after him. Suddenly, another accident occurred. Jimin bumped into a man walking ahead. While they were figuring things out, Kangmin kept running as he didn't notice that something had happened. He only thought that he shouldn't have trusted Wanli, as he had unleashed these monsters on them. Kangmin was so scared that it seemed to him that a huge monster was literally chasing him and was about to pounce. So he decided to turn into an alley. Suddenly, a huge, ugly hand of a monster grabbed him. But it turned out it was not a monster at all. It was just Jimin, who was barely keeping up with him. Suddenly, someone emerged from the darkness. He apologized for the sudden changes and introduced himself as Wanli. Kangmin was frightened, but Wanli said he had been watching them on the way here. But everyone was silent. No one was in a hurry to speak. This was because they had not yet managed to catch their breath and come to their senses. Wanli said that such silence was a bit annoying and tense for the conversation. Jimin yelled that it was his fault they had to run so fast. Wanli was silent at first, then asked if the ticket had indeed been with her at first. Then he asked what time Jimin arrived at the station and how she had paid. She answered clearly without pauses. Wanli thought for a while, after which he agreed that she was telling the truth and said he was glad to meet her. But Jimin did not. She demanded explanations for such a change of plans, and Wanli said they had a tale. He explained that monsters could disguise themselves as ordinary people to sneak up on their victims unnoticed. Wan Li added that it was not out of the question that in the crowd they had passed through several monsters, but the rest of the passengers were here. He said they were now safe. But Jimin did not believe it, as she saw no one else and thought he was deceiving them. But Wan Li said the rest were right behind them. This sounded eerie. They cautiously turned around and saw similarly covered people. Wan Li felt this fear and commotion, so he ordered everyone not to worry and suggested moving away from the moonlight. They decided to go into a cafe. They scared the poor waitress with their appearance of robbers, and also the customers, who immediately began to whisper among themselves. But they immediately took off their masks when they entered the premises. Changmin recounted about that man who supposedly died on the bus. Then he also talked about the police officer they killed. But he decided to remain silent about the murder. The boy with the short haircut emotionally said that everything happened to him the same way. Loss of consciousness, waking up at home. But his mother had turned into a monster. Then Wan Li asked who had seen monsters attack anyone besides the passengers. Changmin said he hadn't seen. Jimin agreed that it was strange, as the monster had even entered their apartment. Wan Li said this only confirmed his story. The lunar vermin indeed pursued only those who had been on that bus. The tattooed boy asked how he knew this. Then Wan Li said it was time to tell his story. He had been corresponding with one of the passengers, and they had arranged to meet. But then something strange happened. She asked if the others would come too, but Wan Li couldn't promise anything. She said she felt greatly relieved when she saw his message because she thought she was going crazy. Wan Li suggested she join him and go together to the meeting. She agreed but had to get ready. While she went into the house, Wan Li decided to sit on his phone. Meanwhile, she entered the entrance and called the elevator. When it arrived on the first floor, a hand suddenly shot out of the elevator and grabbed the girl. Wan Li heard strange sounds, as if someone was being eaten. But when he realized what had happened, it was too late. The monster grabbed her and pierced her body with its sharp tentacles. He hadn't seen such a terrifying monster in a long time, as if it were from a horror movie. At that moment, a man passed by, barely able to stand on his own feet. He walked past the monster. The man was a meter away from the creature, which would have frightened even a drunkard. Yet the monster did nothing to him. But the monster definitely saw that man and simply walked past. At first, Wan Li thought that the monster was satisfied with just the corpse of that girl. But when he listened to them all, he realized that the hunt was only for them. Jimin became curious as to why that monster didn't attack him, to which Wan Li replied that he simply hid. She said it was possible, but there was too little information to assert anything. Wan Li mentioned that he also learned about the identities of the new victims from the news. He claimed that all the victims were passengers of that flight. They simply could not believe it. Now it was truly frightening, as no one wanted to die. Wan Li stated that he was sure the monsters would not stop until they killed them all. The tattooed boy fell into despair and panic. Then he asked what had happened to the cafe patrons, as they had definitely been under the moonlight, yet they were fine. Changmin said that most likely not everyone was susceptible to mutation or didn't immediately turn into monsters. The tattooed boy suggested that their acquaintances might have been susceptible, but neither Changmin nor Jimin knew that cop. They then speculated that it could have been those who got too close, and Wan Li liked that guess. The tattooed boy suggested that they simply had immunity to moonlight. Changmin said that if immunity only applied to passengers, then what about the rest? He somehow thought that it was because of him that everyone turned into monsters, and thus he wouldn't be able to see his family anymore. Suddenly, the room was flooded with red light. Changmin turned sharply in that direction. He saw the police arriving at the cafe. Suddenly, his heart began to race even faster. The police entered the building, after which Changmin ducked down sharply. He realized that they had been tracking his phone the whole time, but the others were waiting for the continuation of his thought. Wan Li turned to the police officers who took drinks and left the cafe. It seemed he understood something. Changmin did not raise his eyes and berated himself for not turning off his phone. Jimin told him that it was a complete failure. She regretted ever going anywhere and wished she had flown back immediately, even if her memory was gone. Then Jimin asked why they were being hunted, and then she clenched her teeth, after which she suddenly exploded, shouting about what was happening to all of them. She turned to the older man, asking if he had anything to say, as he had stuffed his tongue in one place. But he remained silent, so Jimin switched to a loud scream. Wan Li silently observed. Changmin was already embarrassed for his friend. She continued to yell at the man who remained silent. After a prolonged silence, he finally spoke, saying he was just following the conversation and wanted to listen to them before interjecting. Wanli noted that there were still trust issues here. He added that in that case it made no sense to continue as trust could not exist without understanding, so he suggested they introduce themselves one by one. Suddenly a waiter approached them and said they would be closing soon. So they decided to continue outside. They asked Wanli why there were only 5 of them, as all the tickets for the bus had been sold out. He replied that the rest either didn't believe it or were most likely already dead. Changmin was surprised that only they had survived. Wanli replied that was why they needed to join forces. Jimin asked how he found them all, where he got the information. It turned out that Wanli worked as a human resources manager for the company that owned the buses. Jimin was outraged that he had kept that quiet. He said he had to check them out first. So he didn't trust them either. Then the old man said that such an explanation sounded too vague, so he asked for details. Wanli said he obtained their data very simply, as a passenger buys a ticket, and they recorded the transactions on the card and stored them. He was asked if that was legal. Wanli replied that desperate times called for desperate measures. Then the tattooed boy decided to introduce himself. He was Kim Yusun, 17 years old and lived around the corner. The others suddenly fell silent. No one wanted to be the first to start. Then the priest Campbell spoke up, saying he had lived in Seoul since 1990. Next was Changmin, a student. After that, Jimin, also a student, and she was not local. She had come for a vacation. After which, there was silence again. Kim Yusun looked at Wanli. Jimin asked him what the plan was and what to do next since they were all gathered. Wanli said that according to the plan, they were all supposed to go to his house, but Changmin's experience showed that it was dangerous. So he suggested coming up with a new plan as it was better not to wander around. Silence fell. No one had any ideas. Kim Yusun asked if he understood correctly that they needed a location where they could lie low. And then he told them to follow him, as he lived there and knew the area well. Wanli said they couldn't distinguish a person from a monster, so they needed a place without people. But Kim Yusun had just the place. Wanli said that before leaving, it was better to turn off their phones, as monsters in human form were quite intelligent and could track their victims. Kim Yusun was outraged that phones were now banned. Wanli said that was only until sunrise. It was better to just put them in airplane mode. And they complied. Meanwhile, they arrived at the place. Kim Yusun pointed to a building. It was just an apartment building. Changmin said he thought it would be an abandoned house, but it turned out to be quite new. To which Kim Yusun said that the company went bankrupt during construction. There was a warning that video surveillance was in effect. But Kim Yusun said not to worry, as the administration hadn't come here. It was just for show. Then the teenager disappeared somewhere, after which he brought a ladder. He said the fence was quite high, but there was a place to land on the other side. After that, he showed them a masterclass. He easily climbed over the fence. Everyone watched in amazement, after which he jumped down just as easily and landed. Soon everyone climbed over as well. The place indeed looked safe. Jimin asked why the doors weren't locked, to which Kim Yusun said he had cut the lock. They entered inside. The walls and floor were all painted. Changmin was outraged at the vandalism. Racism. To which Kim Yusun shouted that it was actually graffiti art. But now everyone was sure that no one cared about this place and they were safe. Kim Yusun was told to go first. He said it was overall not a bad option, just without light and water, and the moon shone through all the cracks. Changmin was outraged that nothing worked here at all, to which Kim Yusun told him not to be so gloomy. Meanwhile, they climbed to the desired floor. Everyone began to undress and settle in. Wanli said that if they gathered enough supplies, they could hide out here. Just find food, beds, blankets, etc. But for now, Wanli suggested they spend the night like this. Everyone dispersed around the room, but Changmin couldn't sleep and wondered when the rays would stop being so blue. Then he thought about the 2-week gap in his memory. He thought it was somehow related to the full moon. But still, his strength left him, so he decided to lie down and sleep. He thought that if it was all about the moonlight, then the moon's remnants should disappear during the waning phase. That sounded logical. Changmin was almost asleep when suddenly he had the thought that it was not a full moon at all. At that thought, he even woke up. After all, the moonlight would only grow stronger each day, meaning there would be more monsters. He decided it was worth checking what phase the moon was in. Changmin decided it would be fine if he turned on his phone and then immediately switched it to airplane mode. Suddenly, someone asked him what he was doing. It was Jian. She asked him not to do that, because when turned on, the phone would automatically send a signal to the network tower, which is why she hadn't turned hers off. Then Kanmin asked to borrow her phone for a photo. He explained that he wanted to look at the moon through the phone. Jimin thought that there was still a risk. Kenmin said he wasn't looking at the moon directly, so nothing should happen. He zoomed in on the picture, but still couldn't understand what phase it was. Jimin asked what Kanmin thought about her motorcycle, whether it was worth retrieving. He said it was better not to go out unnecessarily. They would take care of everything tomorrow. Then Won-Lee woke up, asking what they were doing. Their activity piqued his interest. Suddenly, Jimin approached him and asked him to be a friend and go get the motorcycle that was left there. Won-Lee asked why it had to be him, to which they replied that he was the one who suddenly changed the meeting place. He fell silent and just looked at her. Jimin extended the keys and told him not to let the cops see him. Won-Lee said it was better if she went alone, as he didn't even know where the parking lot was. Then Jimin agreed to go together. Meanwhile, Kanmin managed to take a clear photo of the moon. And it looked red. He had never seen anything like it before. And it frightened him. The more he looked at the moon, the harder his heart raced. He simply couldn't take his eyes off the moon. Suddenly, he realized how beautiful it was. His eyes seemed to be under hypnosis. His pulse quickened, and new sensations emerged. Suddenly, Kanmin woke up. He had no idea where he was. In a panic, he turned around and realized he was simply under the open sky, but in the shade, hiding from the moon, it seemed. But that did not change the fact that Kanmin did not understand where he was and remembered nothing. Again.